It was a day that would haunt the community of Honolulu for decades. On the morning of March 12, 1977, inside the quiet halls of McKinley High School, a discovery was made that would shock the city to its core and leave unanswered questions hanging over an innocent life. 16-year-old Dawn Momohara, a vibrant and hopeful teenager, was found lifeless on the second floor of the school. But this was no ordinary death. It was brutal, calculated, and devastating. Dawn's body was discovered with an orange cloth tightly knotted around her neck, a grim symbol of the violence inflicted upon her. The forensic evidence told a chilling story of not just strangulation, but also a horrifying sexual assault that made the tragedy all the more devastating. The details were harrowing and unfathomable, leaving investigators and the community reeling. The quiet campus, usually filled with the laughter and chatter of students, was transformed into a scene of horror. Police tape cordoned off the area as officers and detectives scrambled to make sense of what had unfolded in a place meant to be a haven for education and growth. News of the crime spread rapidly, and the shockwave it sent through the local community was almost immediate. Parents, teachers, and students alike were gripped with fear. The once bustling McKinley High School became the backdrop of a nightmare. Students whispered in hushed tones, and parents clutched their children tighter as a collective sense of vulnerability spread like wildfire. Who could commit such a heinous act? Was it someone they knew? And most chillingly, was the perpetrator still lurking among them? The terror was compounded by the fact that Dawn had seemed to vanish without warning. Just a day earlier, she had told her mother she was meeting friends at a local shopping center, an innocent plan that gave no indication of the horror to come. When she didn't return home that evening, worry began to set in. Dawn's family reported her missing, but nothing could prepare them for the news they would receive less than 24 hours later. As police pieced together the events leading to her death, a chilling detail emerged. On the day of her disappearance, Dawn had reportedly received a phone call from an unknown man. What was said during that call remains a mystery, but it marked the beginning of the fateful chain of events that led to her untimely death. Did she know her killer? Did she trust the person who lured her to her demise? These questions would plague investigators for years. As the investigation began, it became clear that solving Dawn's murder would be anything but straightforward. In 1977, forensic science was still in its infancy, and the ability to analyze DNA evidence was decades away. Investigators were left relying on witness accounts, circumstantial evidence, and their own instincts. Leads came and went, but none of them led to a solid suspect. The case grew cold, and with it, the hope for justice for Dawn Momohara seemed to fade. For years, her family lived with the pain of not knowing who took their beloved daughter from them. Her murder became a ghostly presence in the community, a dark chapter that many feared would never be closed. But then, more than 4 decades later, a breakthrough came that no one could have anticipated. In 2019, advancements in DNA testing brought new life to the investigation. Evidence collected from the crime scene, long dormant in storage, was re-examined using cutting-edge forensic technology. The results were startling. Investigators were finally able to identify a suspect, Gideon Castro, a man who had graduated from McKinley High just a year before Dawn's death. The revelation sent shockwaves through the community once again. Castro, now a 66-year-old man living in a nursing home in Utah, had evaded justice for decades. His connection to Dawn became the focal point of renewed investigative efforts, offering a glimmer of hope to a family and a community that had waited far too long for answers. As we delve into this story, we'll explore the life of Dawn Momohara, the horrifying details of her murder, and the tireless efforts of investigators to bring her killer to justice. This is not just a story of a crime. It's a story of resilience, of breakthroughs in science, and of the enduring human desire for closure and justice. But before we move forward, let us remember Dawn not as a victim, but as a young girl with dreams, a life full of potential that was cruelly cut short. Her story is one that demands to be told, not only to honor her memory, but to shine a light on the power of perseverance and the relentless pursuit of truth. Stay with us as we unravel the layers of this chilling case, piece by piece, from the fateful phone call to the arrest of a suspect more than 40 years later. This is the story of Dawn Momohara, a life stolen, and a mystery finally on the brink of resolution. 16-year-old Dawn Momohara was, by all accounts, the kind of teenager everyone admired. She was a beacon of youthful optimism, a girl with a bright smile and a kind heart who brought warmth to those around her. Born and raised in the vibrant city of Honolulu, Dawn embodied the spirited energy of her community. Her family, deeply rooted in the cultural fabric of the city, cherished her as their light and joy, a daughter who was as compassionate as she was ambitious. Dawn was known for her unwavering kindness, a trait that made her stand out among her peers. Friends and neighbors often spoke of how she would go out of her way to help others, whether it was assisting classmates with homework, volunteering at local events, or simply offering a listening ear to those in need. Her generosity and empathy painted the portrait of a young woman who truly cared about the world around her. But Dawn wasn't just kind. She was also incredibly driven. A junior at McKinley High School, she was determined to carve a bright future for herself. Dawn dreamed of one day becoming a nurse, a career she saw as a way to continue helping others on a larger scale. Her family recalled how she often spoke of wanting to make them proud, a sentiment that resonated deeply with her tight-knit community. Despite her ambition, Dawn was also a typical teenager who loved spending time with friends, going to the movies, and browsing the bustling shopping centers of Honolulu. She had a natural charisma that drew people to her, and she was often the glue that held her friend group together. But beneath her easygoing demeanor was a strong sense of independence, a quality that both inspired and worried her family. Her mother, in particular, often expressed concern about her growing independence. Honolulu, though beautiful and welcoming, wasn't immune to danger. Like many parents, Dawn's mother reminded her to stay vigilant, especially when out alone. Those warnings, however, felt like distant worries in the safety of their community. After all, crimes of the magnitude that would claim Dawn's life were rare, almost unheard of. On the day she disappeared, Dawn seemed like her usual self, cheerful, composed, and eager to meet up with friends. She had promised her mother she would return home after stopping by the shopping center, a familiar routine that gave no hint of the tragedy to come. For her family, the sudden and violent loss of their beloved Dawn was more than a personal tragedy. It was an unimaginable rupture in the fabric of their lives. Dawn's story is not just about the crime that took her life. It's about a young woman full of promise, a daughter whose laughter once filled a home, and a friend who left an indelible mark on everyone she met. Her untimely death shattered not only her family, but also an entire community that struggled to reconcile such a brutal act with the vibrant girl they had known. To truly understand the weight of this tragedy, we must step back and explore the world Dawn lived in, Honolulu in the late 1970s. The city, nestled in the heart of Hawaii, was a blend of breathtaking natural beauty and rich cultural heritage. Known for its pristine beaches, bustling markets, and vibrant multicultural atmosphere, Honolulu was a place where life often felt idyllic. But beneath the postcard-perfect image of paradise was a community grappling with its own challenges. The 1970s were a time of transition for Hawaii. The state had only recently been admitted to the Union, and its identity was evolving. While tourism flourished, bringing economic growth, it also introduced a subtle shift in the dynamics of local communities. The influx of visitors and mainland influences began to blur the lines between Honolulu's traditional way of life and the growing pressures of modernization. For residents like Dawn and her family, life was a mix of old traditions and new opportunities. McKinley High School, where Dawn was a student, was a reflection of this blend. the school one of the oldest in the state, had a long history of academic excellence and community involvement. Its halls were filled with students from diverse backgrounds, each bringing their unique stories to the shared experience of education. Yet, even in a place like McKinley, the crime that claimed Dawn's life was unimaginable. The school had always been a symbol of growth and achievement, not a setting for tragedy. When news of Dawn's murder broke, it sent shockwaves through the student body. The very place where young people gathered to learn and dream had become a crime scene, a chilling reminder that even the safest spaces could harbor danger. Adding to the sense of vulnerability was the fact that Honolulu was not accustomed to violent crimes of this nature. While petty thefts and minor infractions were not uncommon, the city rarely witnessed the kind of brutality that took Dawn's life. Her murder marked a turning point, a moment when the community realized that they were not immune to the darker aspects of human nature. Compounding the difficulty of solving crimes in the 1970s was the limited scope of forensic science. Unlike today, when DNA testing and advanced technologies can pinpoint suspects with remarkable accuracy, investigators in Dawn's time had far fewer tools at their disposal. Evidence collection relied heavily on physical clues, witness statements, and intuition. The lack of advanced forensic methods meant that many cases, like Dawn's, went unsolved for years. Detectives often faced insurmountable challenges in gathering sufficient evidence to identify and prosecute perpetrators. In Dawn's case, the DNA evidence that would later crack the case sat dormant for decades, a silent witness to a crime that seemed destined to remain a mystery. Beyond the practical limitations, there was also a societal attitude toward crime that influenced investigations. In the 1970s, there was a tendency to view violent crime as something distant, something that happened elsewhere. Honolulu's community, like many others, believed in the inherent safety of their city. That belief was shattered by Dawn's murder, forcing the community to confront the harsh reality that danger could strike anywhere, even in the heart of paradise. The cultural backdrop of Dawn's story adds another layer of complexity to the tragedy. Her death was not just a loss for her family, but also a blow to the collective sense of security in Honolulu. It exposed the cracks in the idyllic image of island life, reminding everyone that even in a place as beautiful as Hawaii, darkness could still lurk. As we reflect on Dawn's life and the world she lived in, it becomes clear that her story is more than just a true crime case. It is a reflection of a community grappling with loss, a family seeking justice, and a society awakening to the fragility of innocence. Her life, though tragically cut short, continues to resonate, a poignant reminder of the need to protect and cherish the people we hold dear. March 11, 1977, was like any other day in Honolulu. The city hummed with its usual energy, and the Momohara household began their morning routines without any inkling of the nightmare that was about to unfold. 16-year-old Dawn was cheerful and composed as she prepared for her day, exchanging light-hearted words with her mother before heading out. But an unsettling detail marked that morning, a phone call from an unidentified man. The conversation was brief, but Dawn's demeanor shifted slightly afterward. She seemed thoughtful, perhaps even distracted. While she didn't share much about the call, she assured her mother that she planned to meet her friends at Ala Moana Shopping Center, one of Honolulu's busiest and most popular retail hubs. It was a familiar place, bustling with shoppers and families, where teenagers like Dawn frequently gathered. Dawn left the house in the early afternoon, carrying a small purse and dressed casually in the style of the time. Her mother watched her go, comforted by the knowledge that she'd be surrounded by friends and promising herself that her daughter would be home by dinner. The last glimpse she had of Dawn was of her walking confidently out the door, full of life and possibility. As the hours passed, concern began to creep into the Momohara household. Evening approached, and Dawn had not yet returned. Her mother, initially dismissing her unease as overprotectiveness, tried calling the friends Dawn was supposed to meet. To her dismay, None of them had seen Dawn that day. The shopping center, bustling with people just hours earlier, had now closed its doors for the night. By nightfall, worry had turned into panic. Dawn's mother reported her missing to the Honolulu Police Department. Officers responded promptly, given the circumstances, but the initial advice was to wait. Teenagers, they reasoned, often stayed out late without informing their families. However, Dawn's mother knew her daughter well enough to recognize that something was wrong. Dawn wasn't the type to ignore curfews or leave her family in the dark. The hours stretched into a sleepless night, with her family alternating between frantic calls to anyone who might have seen Dawn and pacing the house in mounting dread. The streets of Honolulu, usually serene under the glow of streetlights, now felt menacing. Every shadow, every unknown figure, seemed to whisper an unthinkable possibility. Something terrible had happened to Dawn. Enjoying the story so far? Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss an update on gripping true crime stories like this one. The following morning, on March 12, 1977, the unimaginable became a grim reality. Shortly after sunrise, a janitor arrived at McKinley High School to begin his day. The quiet campus, still devoid of its usual student activity, held an eerie stillness. As he climbed the stairs to the second floor, something caught his eye, a shape that seemed out of place in the hallway's muted shadows. Approaching cautiously, the janitor's heart sank. It was Dawn. She lay motionless, her body lifeless and unnaturally still. The orange cloth tied tightly around her neck stood out starkly against her pale skin, a grotesque reminder of the violence she had endured. Her belongings were scattered nearby, as though abandoned in a sudden and chaotic struggle. The janitor immediately called the authorities, his voice shaking as he described what he had found. Within minutes, police and emergency responders arrived, their sirens cutting through the morning silence. The scene was quickly cordoned off, and investigators began their work. The condition of Dawn's body told a harrowing story. She had been sexually assaulted and strangled, the orange cloth around her neck serving as both a weapon and a chilling symbol of the brutality inflicted upon her. There were signs of a struggle, bruises on her arms and defensive wounds on her hands, but it was clear that she had been overpowered. News of the discovery spread quickly, sending shockwaves through the community. Parents held their children closer. Students at McKinley High were overcome with grief, and the city's sense of safety was shattered. Dawn's family was notified of her death, and their world came crashing down. The vibrant, hopeful girl they had cherished was gone, stolen from them in an act of unspeakable cruelty. As investigators worked to collect evidence, they were met with challenges that would plague the case for decades. The crime scene, though carefully examined, offered few immediate clues. The technology available at the time was limited, and DNA analysis, which would later prove crucial, was still years away from being a viable investigative tool. In the days following the discovery of Dawn's body, the Honolulu Police Department mobilized its resources to solve the case. Detectives interviewed students, faculty, and staff at McKinley High, hoping to uncover any information about suspicious activity in the area. Flyers bearing Dawn's picture were distributed across the city, urging anyone with information to come forward. Witnesses reported seeing Dawn at the shopping center the day before, but none could recall seeing her leave or interacting with anyone suspicious. The phone call she had received on the day of her disappearance became a key focus of the investigation. Detectives believed it might have been from her killer, but without a way to trace the call or identify the caller, it remained a frustrating dead end. Physical evidence collected at the crime scene included the orange cloth, which investigators believed might have been brought by the perpetrator, and trace evidence from Dawn's body. However, without the ability to analyze DNA, much of this evidence was left unexamined or inconclusive. The lack of leads and the absence of modern forensic tools made progress slow. Investigators were left to rely on old-fashioned detective work, combing through records, tracking down potential witnesses, and following up on tips from the public. But as days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, the trail grew cold. Compounding the difficulty of the investigation was the social climate of the time. In the 1970s, crimes involving sexual violence were often stigmatized, and victims' families sometimes faced undue scrutiny or blame. Dawn's family, already devastated by her loss, had to endure whispered judgments and invasive questions from those who should have offered support. Despite these challenges, investigators remained committed to finding justice for Dawn. They revisited the crime scene, reviewed witness statements, and explored every possible lead. But the limitations of their tools and the lack of solid evidence meant that the case eventually stalled. By the end of 1977, the investigation had reached an impasse. Detectives continued to revisit the case periodically, hoping for a breakthrough, but none came. The file on Dawn Momohara's murder was placed among the growing stack of cold cases, a grim reminder of the lives cut short and the justice left unfulfilled. When police arrived at the crime scene on the second floor of McKinley High School on March 12, 1977, the task before them was grim and overwhelming. Investigators had to meticulously comb through every piece of evidence, knowing that their ability to preserve and analyze these details would be crucial in identifying Dawn Momohara's killer. At a time when forensic science was far less advanced than it is today, this was no small feat. Officers first focused on securing the area where Dawn's body was found. The scene was cordoned off with police tape, and access was strictly limited to law enforcement and crime scene technicians. Investigators took photographs from multiple angles, hoping to capture every relevant detail. The orange cloth tied around her neck became an immediate point of interest. Its unique texture and the manner in which it had been knotted suggested it might hold critical clues about the killer's identity. Detectives then turned their attention to the scattered items near Dawn's body. A small purse, some loose personal belongings, and fragments of what appeared to be torn fabric were carefully collected and cataloged. Although these objects didn't provide immediate answers, they were preserved in evidence bags for potential future analysis. The scene was then dusted for fingerprints, but any usable prints were either absent or too smudged to provide a clear match. The condition of Dawn's body revealed more about the brutality of the crime. Her injuries indicated a violent struggle, and authorities believed the killer might have scratches or bruises from her attempts to defend herself. With this in mind, detectives began canvassing nearby hospitals and clinics, hoping that someone matching this profile had sought treatment. However, these efforts proved fruitless. As the investigation expanded, police began interviewing individuals who might have seen or interacted with Dawn in the hours leading up to her death. They spoke with students and staff at McKinley High School, as well as employees and visitors at Ala Moana Shopping Center, where Dawn had reportedly planned to meet her friends. Witnesses were asked if they had seen anyone acting suspiciously, if they noticed Dawn speaking with someone unfamiliar, or if they recalled any unusual activity around the school on the night of March 11th. Despite these efforts, no one could provide definitive information about what had happened to Dawn after she left her home. Her friends were adamant that they hadn't seen her at the shopping center that day, and no one at the school could recall hearing or seeing anything unusual that might explain how she ended up there. The investigation hit an early roadblock when it came to the phone call Dawn received before she disappeared. Police were unable to trace the call, as technology in the 1970s didn't allow for the kind of call tracking capabilities we take for granted today. Without a way to identify the caller or verify its connection to the crime, this lead grew cold. Compounding these challenges was the lack of physical evidence linking anyone to the crime. The orange cloth, while distinctive, didn't point to a specific suspect. Similarly, while there were signs of sexual assault, the biological evidence collected at the scene couldn't be analyzed in the way it can today. The absence of DNA testing technology left investigators relying heavily on witness accounts and circumstantial evidence, neither of which yielded concrete results. As weeks turned into months, the case began to lose momentum. Despite the best efforts of law enforcement, the trail had gone cold. Leads dried up, and public interest waned as the months stretched into years. Dawn's murder remained unsolved, becoming another tragic addition to the growing list of cold cases in Honolulu. The story of Dawn Momohara's murder might have ended there, buried under decades of unanswered questions, were it not for a groundbreaking development in forensic science. In 2019, over 40 years after her death, investigators revisited the case armed with tools that would have been unimaginable in the 1970s. One of the most significant advances in forensic technology was the ability to extract and analyze DNA from biological evidence, even after decades had passed. Samples collected from Dawn's body and the crime scene, which had been preserved in storage for over 4 decades, were now subjected to cutting-edge testing. The DNA evidence was processed through sophisticated analysis methods, generating a genetic profile that could be compared against databases of known offenders and suspects. This process was painstaking and meticulous, requiring experts to carefully handle the decades-old samples to avoid contamination or degradation. The breakthrough came when the DNA profile matched not just one person, but 2, brothers Gideon and Michael Castro. Both men had genetic markers that linked them to the crime scene, but additional testing would be needed to determine which brother was responsible. Investigators faced a new challenge, narrowing their focus to the individual who had committed the crime. The initial revelation was shocking. Gideon Castro, who was 66 years old at the time, had lived in Honolulu during the 1970s and graduated from McKinley High School a year before Dawn's death. He had reportedly met Dawn at a school dance, an event that now seemed eerily significant in light of the evidence. His younger brother Michael, though also a match to the genetic profile, was eventually ruled out through more precise DNA analysis. Investigators delved into Gideon's past, piecing together his movements and behaviors around the time of the crime. They discovered that he had left Honolulu not long after Dawn's murder, eventually settling in Utah. His relatively unremarkable life in the decades since, including his current residence in a nursing home, stood in stark contrast to the horrifying crime he was now accused of committing. The process of identifying Gideon as the sole suspect involved advanced genetic genealogy, a technique that uses DNA to trace familial connections. By analyzing unique markers within the genetic material, forensic experts were able to definitively link Gideon to the crime scene. This method, which had gained prominence in recent years, represented a monumental leap forward in the fight against cold cases. Once Gideon was identified, authorities began the delicate process of building a case against him. While the DNA evidence was compelling, it was crucial to corroborate it with additional information. Investigators reviewed old records, re-examined witness statements, and sought to establish a timeline that connected Gideon to Dawn in the days leading up to her murder. In 2019, Gideon was taken into custody at a nursing home in Utah. The arrest was a long-awaited moment of justice for Dawn's family and the community that had mourned her loss for decades. While formal charges had yet to be filed, the weight of the evidence against him was undeniable. To understand how Gideon Castro became the focus of one of Honolulu's most haunting cold cases, we must delve into the shadows of his life. Castro, a 19-year-old at the time of Dawn Momohara's murder, had walked the same halls of McKinley High School that would later become the scene of the heinous crime. He had graduated just 1 year before Dawn entered her junior year, making their presence on campus only briefly overlapping. Gideon's life during his teenage years seemed ordinary on the surface. Described by former classmates as reserved and somewhat unremarkable, he did not stand out academically or socially. He kept mostly to himself, avoiding the spotlight while maintaining an average presence in school activities. However, there were whispers of a darker side. Some who knew him recalled a brooding nature that occasionally surfaced, a tendency to become irritable or withdrawn when things didn't go his way. One detail for his high school years would later gain significant importance: Castro's attendance at a school dance. It was here that he reportedly crossed paths with Dawn Momohara. Witnesses described a brief encounter between the two, though the specifics remained hazy. Some suggested that Gideon may have taken an interest in Dawn, while others speculated that the interaction was fleeting and unremarkable. Regardless, this connection would later take on a sinister weight in light of the evidence tying him to the crime scene. After graduating, Gideon left McKinley High and drifted through life with little direction. He worked sporadically, taking on various low-skilled jobs, and eventually left Honolulu altogether. He relocated to the mainland United States, where he lived a largely anonymous existence. By the time investigators revisited the case in 2019, Gideon was a 66-year-old man residing in a Utah nursing home. His life seemed quiet, almost forgettable, a stark contrast to the horrifying allegations now leveled against him. The discovery of Gideon's DNA at the crime scene shattered the facade of his unassuming life. Investigators began piecing together a timeline of his actions in the months leading up to Dawn's murder, uncovering details that suggested a darker side to his character. While the full extent of his interactions with Dawn remains unclear, the possibility of a predatory fixation on her began to take shape. Understanding why Gideon Castro may have committed such a brutal crime requires a closer look at the psychology of the act itself. The violence inflicted on Dawn, both physical and sexual, suggests a deeply personal and premeditated motive. This wasn't a random act of opportunity. It was deliberate, calculated, and disturbingly intimate. One theory centers on rejection. If Gideon did harbor feelings for Dawn, it's possible that she rebuffed his advances. Rejection can be a powerful trigger for individuals with fragile egos or underlying psychological issues, leading to acts of violence as a distorted form of retaliation. In this context, the crime may have been an attempt to assert control over someone he perceived as unattainable. Another possibility is that Gideon saw Dawn as an object of obsession. Their reported interaction at the school dance, while brief, may have planted the seeds of fixation. Obsessive behaviors often escalate over time, with the individual rationalizing increasingly invasive or harmful actions to fulfill their perceived desires. This could explain the calculated nature of the crime, including the use of the orange cloth as both a weapon and a symbol of dominance. Alternatively, the motive could have been rooted in a twisted sense of entitlement. Individuals who commit crimes like this often view their victims as possessions rather than people, justifying their actions through warped logic. For Gideon, the opportunity to act on these impulses may have coincided with a moment of opportunity, a chance encounter with Dawn that ended in tragedy. While the exact motive may never be fully understood, the nature of the crime points to a perpetrator with deep-seated issues, someone capable of planning and executing an act of extreme violence without remorse. One of the most chilling aspects of Dawn's disappearance is the phone call she received on the day of her murder. This brief conversation, reportedly with an unknown man, may hold the key to understanding how she ended up at McKinley High School that night. The significance of the call cannot be overstated. It marked the beginning of a chain of events that would ultimately lead to Dawn's death. But what was said during that conversation? Did the caller lure her out of the safety of her home? Or was it a coincidental interaction that took on greater importance in hindsight? If Gideon Castro was the caller, it suggests a level of premeditation that elevates the crime from opportunistic to calculated. It's possible that he used the call to build a false sense of trust, convincing Dawn that meeting him was safe. Alternatively, the call may have been more coercive, with the caller using threats or manipulation to compel her to leave. The timing of the call raises additional questions. How did the caller know that Dawn would be home at that moment? Was he watching her, waiting for the right opportunity to strike? These unsettling possibilities paint a picture of a predator who had been planning his actions long before the fatal encounter. While the content of the call remains a mystery, its role in the crime is undeniable. It represents the moment when Dawn's fate was sealed, the point at which her ordinary day took a sinister turn. Over the years, as the case remained unsolved, various theories emerged to fill the void left by the lack of answers. Some speculated that Dawn's murder was the work of a serial offender, someone who had committed similar crimes in other cities or states. This theory gained traction due to the brutal nature of the crime and its apparent lack of connection to anyone in Dawn's immediate circle. Others suggested that the murder might have been a crime of opportunity, committed by a transient or someone passing through Honolulu at the time. The location of McKinley High School, though central to the community, was not heavily monitored at night, making it a plausible setting for an opportunistic attack. There were also whispers of institutional failures. Some questioned whether law enforcement had overlooked key evidence or suspects in the early stages of the investigation. This theory was fueled by the frustration of a community desperate for answers and the perception that the case had been mishandled. However, the most prominent conspiracy theory revolved around Gideon Castro himself. Once his DNA was linked to the crime scene, some speculated that he may not have acted alone. Could someone else have been involved, either as an accomplice or a silent witness? While no evidence has surfaced to support this theory, it remains a lingering question in the minds of those who have followed the case. More than 4 decades after the brutal murder of 16-year-old Dawn Momohara, a critical breakthrough finally led investigators to the person they believed was responsible, Gideon Castro. Tracking down a man who had spent decades living a quiet, unremarkable life proved to be a meticulous and painstaking process, one that demanded a mix of modern technology, old-fashioned detective work, and an unyielding commitment to justice. After DNA evidence linked Castro to the crime scene, investigators turned their attention to locating him. By 2019, Castro was living in a nursing home in Utah, a state far removed from the sunny shores of Honolulu where his crime had occurred. The path that had led him there was one of evasion. Whether deliberate or coincidental remains unclear. After leaving Honolulu in the years following his graduation, Castro had seemingly drifted, taking on odd jobs and keeping a low profile. He had never raised suspicion, blending into the communities he passed through, leaving no outward trace of the dark secret he carried. The breakthrough in DNA testing reignited the investigation, and detectives began quietly gathering information about Castro's current whereabouts. They worked closely with law enforcement agencies in Utah, coordinating efforts to ensure the arrest was carried out without complication. The goal was clear: bring Castro into custody without alerting him, minimizing the risk of flight or destruction of evidence. On the morning of his arrest, officers arrived at the nursing home with an arrest warrant in hand. It was a surreal moment. Decades of investigative efforts had led to this quiet facility where Castro, now an elderly man, lived among other aging residents. Detectives approached with caution, aware of the weight of the moment. When officers confronted Castro, his reaction was subdued. He did not resist, nor did he show much emotion. The man who had been identified as the prime suspect in a decades-old murder now faced the full force of the law. He was escorted out of the nursing home in handcuffs, his frail appearance a stark contrast to the gravity of the crime he was accused of committing. The arrest marked a pivotal moment in the case. For Dawn's family, it was a long-awaited step toward justice. For the community of Honolulu, it was a reminder that time, though often a thief, could also be an ally in uncovering the truth. And for law enforcement, it was a testament to the power of persistence and the advancements in forensic science that had made this moment possible. While the arrest of Gideon Castro was a significant milestone, it was far from the end of the legal journey. The road to justice was paved with complexities, many of which stemmed from the sheer amount of time that had passed since the crime. One of the first hurdles was the process of formalizing charges against Castro. Although the DNA evidence provided a strong link to the crime, prosecutors needed to build a comprehensive case that would hold up in court. This involved revisiting decades-old evidence, re-interviewing witnesses, and ensuring that the chain of custody for all materials had been properly maintained over the years. Any discrepancies or gaps in the evidence could be exploited by the defense, potentially jeopardizing the case. Another significant challenge was the statute of limitations. In many jurisdictions, certain types of crimes can no longer be prosecuted after a specific period has passed. However, in cases of murder, these limitations are often waived, reflecting the severity of the crime. In this instance, the statute of limitations did not apply, allowing prosecutors to move forward without that legal obstacle. The passage of time also posed challenges in terms of witness testimony. Memories fade, and individuals who might have provided crucial information years ago may no longer be available or able to recall events with clarity. Prosecutors faced the daunting task of reconstructing a case that was decades old, piecing together fragments of evidence and testimony to create a cohesive narrative for the jury. Additionally, there were logistical concerns. Transporting Castro from Utah to Hawaii for trial required careful coordination, as well as ensuring that his rights were protected. Given his advanced age and health condition, these factors added another layer of complexity to the legal proceedings. Despite these challenges, the resolve of prosecutors and investigators remained unwavering. They were determined to see the case through, not only for Dawn and her family, but also for the community that had waited so long for answers. The legal system prepared to move forward methodically, knowing that every detail had to be accounted for to ensure a successful prosecution. The news of Gideon Castro's arrest spread rapidly, sparking a wave of emotions across Honolulu and beyond. For a community that had lived with the unanswered questions surrounding Dawn Momohara's murder, the announcement brought a mix of relief, hope, and lingering sorrow. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss an update on gripping true crime stories like this one. For Dawn's family, the arrest was a bittersweet moment. While it offered a long-awaited step toward closure, it also reopened old wounds. The memories of their beloved daughter, though cherished, were inextricably tied to the pain of her loss. They expressed gratitude to the investigators who had never given up on the case and to the advancements in technology that had finally brought them this breakthrough. In the broader community, reactions ranged from shock to vindication. Many residents who had lived in Honolulu at the time of Dawn's murder recalled the fear and uncertainty that had gripped the city in 1977. The arrest served as a reminder of the fragility of innocence and the resilience of those who fight for justice. Social media became a platform for discussion, with users sharing their thoughts and theories about the case. True crime enthusiasts, both locally and internationally, analyzed the details of the arrest and speculated about the upcoming trial. News outlets revisited the story, bringing attention to the decades of investigative work that had led to this moment. Some, however, questioned why it had taken so long to bring Castro to justice. They pointed to the limitations of forensic technology in the 1970s as a factor, while others criticized the initial handling of the case. These discussions highlighted the complexities of cold case investigations and the importance of preserving evidence for future breakthroughs. Despite the mixed emotions, one sentiment was universal, a sense of gratitude for the dedication of those who had never given up on Dawn's case. The arrest of Gideon Castro was not just a victory for the family and community. It was a testament to the enduring power of persistence, science, and the pursuit of truth. Even with the arrest of Gideon Castro, several questions continue to haunt this decades-old case. While DNA evidence provided a pivotal breakthrough, the full story of what happened to Dawn Momohara on that tragic day in 1977 remains incomplete. For every question answered, another emerges, deepening the mystery surrounding this horrifying crime. One of the most significant unanswered questions revolves around Gideon Castro's motive. What drove him to commit such a heinous act? While the nature of the crime suggests elements of control and violence, the underlying reasons remain murky. Was this a calculated act born from obsession, or was it an impulsive crime of opportunity? The fact that Castro had reportedly interacted with Dawn at a school dance prior to her murder raises additional questions about his intentions and whether his fixation on her had been brewing for some time. Equally unsettling is the possibility that others may have been involved in some capacity. The crime, as violent and deliberate as it was, may not have been executed in isolation. Could someone have helped Castro orchestrate the events that led to Dawn's death, either knowingly or unknowingly? Witnesses have suggested that Dawn received a phone call the day she vanished, but the identity of the caller remains unknown. If it wasn't Castro, then who was it? Could the caller have acted as a co-conspirator or an unwitting participant in a larger, more sinister plan? Another lingering mystery is how Dawn ended up at McKinley High School, a place she wasn't expected to be that evening. Did she go there willingly, believing she was meeting someone she trusted? Or was she coerced or forcibly taken there? The lack of witnesses to her movements that night leaves this part of the timeline frustratingly incomplete. The orange cloth used to strangle Dawn is another haunting detail that remains unexplained. Where did it come from, and why was it chosen as the weapon? Was it something Castro had premeditatedly brought with him, or was it an object of opportunity he found at the scene? Understanding its origin could provide critical insights into Castro's mindset and whether the crime was planned or spur of the moment. The passage of time has also obscured potential clues. Are there individuals who know more than they've shared? Was there evidence overlooked or misinterpreted during the initial investigation? These lingering doubts continue to fuel speculation and highlight the complexity of cold case investigations, where every detail, no matter how small, carries the weight of a possible breakthrough. With Castro's arrest, the wheels of justice have begun to turn, but the road ahead is fraught with challenges. Prosecutors face the monumental task of building a case strong enough to withstand the scrutiny of both the courtroom and public opinion. The evidence, though compelling, must be presented in a manner that leaves no room for doubt. One likely step in the legal process is the presentation of the DNA evidence as the cornerstone of the case. This evidence, combined with Castro's past connection to Dawn and the circumstances of his arrest, creates a strong narrative for the prosecution. However, the defense will undoubtedly scrutinize every aspect of the investigation, from the preservation of evidence to the methods used to extract and analyze the DNA. Another potential outcome revolves around Castro's willingness, or lack thereof, to cooperate. If he maintains his innocence, the trial could become a lengthy and arduous process, requiring prosecutors to rely heavily on circumstantial evidence and expert testimony. On the other hand, if Castro chooses to confess or accept a plea deal, it could bring a quicker resolution, though perhaps at the expense of fully uncovering the truth behind his actions. For Dawn's family, justice may take many forms. While a conviction would provide closure in the legal sense, it cannot erase the pain of losing their daughter. True justice for them lies not only in holding Castro accountable, but also in ensuring that her story is told, remembered, and honored. The legal proceedings will be a chance to finally give voice to Dawn, whose life was stolen far too soon. Beyond the courtroom, this case has broader implications for the justice system and society as a whole. It highlights the importance of preserving evidence, even in cases that grow cold, and underscores the transformative power of advancements in forensic technology. The outcome of this trial could serve as a beacon of hope for other families waiting for answers, showing that no matter how much time passes, justice remains within reach.